If a whale is a mammal and a duck is a dinosaur, woodlouse is a crustacean, poodle is a wolf, and according to Cladistics going down the tree of life, then clearly people are fish.
Hello, welcome back to People are Fish. I am Elliott, and with me today to talk about Archosaurs from the Triassic period is Emily Keeble.
Thank you for having me. I am a PhD candidate at Virginia Tech in the USA at the moment in vertebrate paleontology. My research at the moment is mostly focusing on the morphology and discrete characters of Archosaur teeth from the late Triassic and a couple of Archosaur morphs outside for that outgroup. My previous degree, my master's, I got in Bristol back in the UK. And again, I was looking at Triassic stuff there. I've had jobs writing for Eons, writing and consulting for DK Books, working with the Dawn Dinos project with John Hutchinson, looking at biomechanics of Triassic Archosaurs. And I've interned in a museum in the US a couple of times now. So all sorts of things I've in my background.
And when I got in touch with you, the first thing you said was, I could talk about Triassic Archosaurs. Brief summary, because some people don't know what either of those words are. Most people don't really have a good idea of what the Triassic is. And I think a very strong example of that being the fact that most people only really know animals from the Cretaceous. Even Jurassic Park only really features animals from the Cretaceous, let alone our lovely Triassic animals. But in the supercontinent Pangea, basically throughout most of the time of the dinosaurs, Pangea had broken apart. And actually the only time that Pangea, we have this big supercontinent, is during this time when most of the fauna are species that most people haven't heard of. So if you're picturing at home a T-Rex, that was basically living on a globe that looked very similar to what we live on today. The Triassic was this time of a supercontinent. The separation of this continent basically defines the entire era.
And then the Triassic itself, it goes all the way to 201 million years ago. And then after that, it's followed by the more famous Jurassic. The two surviving groups of Archosaurs that we have today are the crocodilians, which includes crocodiles, alligators, caimans, etc., and also birds, which have rather more groups, so I won't list any of them. These animals are descended from an ancestral Archosaur that lived sometime in the latest Permian, early Triassic. We don't have quite the fossil record to show because the fossil record kind of sucks a lot of the time. They both do things like lay eggs. There's a degree of parental care in both of those. They both have quite efficient breathing systems.
Unilateral airflow in their breathing being different from all other vertebrates alive today who are you and I. We're breathing in, we're breathing out. But first I had heard of that. That just blew my mind, the fact that there's just another way that you can breathe. Because I thought everyone just did it the same way. But it shows how the tree of life branches and how there's lots of different... There's not just one way of doing things.
Oh, yeah. We have a lot of carbon dioxide sitting in our lungs and they don't have that. So they have fresh air going through. Birds take it to a whole other level by developing systems of air sacs, and we see this certainly in Saurischian dinosaurs. So that's the Sauropods and the Theropods throughout the skeleton. They have hollow bones and there's airways and things going all over the place, which allows them to breathe more deeply, breathe more efficiently. It helps them to get really big because they can just breathe in more oxygen, and all these air sacs lightens the skeleton a lot as well. And scales. So crocodilians obviously all over the body. Birds, they have these scales on the feet, some of which seem to be homologous to reptilian scales. Birds are in fact reptiles, and some that seem to be of a different origin.
I think you just referencing birds being reptiles, I suppose we should just kind of summarise what a clade is, because that helps define what an Archosaur is.
Yeah, I'll focus on Archosaurs because it's a really good example. So sort of traditionally in science, we had a group called Reptilia, and this included things like lizards, snakes, turtles, crocodiles, but it excluded birds. So this is not what we'd call a clade, really, because a clade, everything has to be descended from one common ancestor. So that's what we get here. You get this group that works as a clade. But if you're excluding any ancestors, if you're picking from different groups and just mushing them together, these are not clades in modern cladistics at all.
Great. So are all reptiles Archosaurs?
No. Archosauria is just a clade within Sauropsida, which is the more encompassing, like, real clade of reptiles. So we've got Archosaurs, and they split into the Pseudosuchians, which is the crocodile-line Archosaurs, so leading towards crocodiles today. And then you get the Ave Metatarsalia, and this includes like pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and then of course, because you have dinosaurs, birds are dinosaurs, so birds are included in them. They're the bird-line Archosaurs. Lizards, snakes, etc. are in their own group, Lepidosaurs, and turtles are a wild card. They sort of flip-flop about. Most people seem to be saying that they're probably Archosauromorphs at the moment, but I don't do turtles. There's too much going on there.
It's best not to comment on it too confidently, I think. Yeah, we'll move around. So that's the group. When did this clade begin?
So likely in the early Triassic. We just have to look at it like going backwards. So we get the first sort of potential dinosaurs appearing around 240 million years ago. Probably sort of between 250 to 245 million years ago is when we sort of probably would have seen the first Archosaur ancestor. Something quite like the euparkariids is thought to be ancestral to Archosaurs. So these are reasonably small, kind of frock-looking, maybe like a caiman almost, but they're much more upright, or at least semi-sprawling. They have laterally flattened, curved serrated teeth. So carnivores, these guys are running about, eating small prey, potentially things like eggs, the smaller ones, maybe even some insects. There's so many different groups and different critters. It's not until much later that we start to see much more familiar and much larger Archosaurs arriving on the scene in the Mesozoic.
The Archosaurs end up taking up a lot of niches.
Oh yeah, we see this really big expansion and diversification of Archosaurs. Sort of in the middle Triassic, towards the late Triassic, we see our first dinosaurs, and we see separation from sort of the other branch of Archosaurs, which is called Pseudosuchia. And the Pseudosuchians, so this is the crocodile-line Archosaurs, they were the more dominant group at first. So in the Triassic, especially in like the late Triassic, a lot of these ecosystems are dominated by Pseudosuchians, not by dinosaurs. So we get really, really big things like Rausuchians. Probably the most famous one of that is Postosuchus, which featured in Walking with Dinosaurs in the first episode.
Postosuchus, a merciless ambush predator, the largest carnivore on Earth.
Looking forward to the new series that's coming out. So this is like a big carnivore. It's got this quite like boxy head full of razor-sharp teeth, probably like facultatively quadrupedal, so it's mostly bipedal, but it could like walk on four legs sometimes if it wanted to. But as well as these like big predators, we get a lot of smaller things or very different things. So one clade that I've really focused on is the Aetosaurs. This sort of means like eagle lizard. It's a reference to the shape of their faces, which are like quite long, fairly triangular, and a lot of them have this like upturned snoot, which is very cute. This is a clade of most likely predominantly herbivores. There are a couple of weirdos, and there may have been like some insectivity going on there as well. But primarily they're herbivores, so very, very different from the large predators and crocodiles of today. And in between, like the herbivore and the big old carnivores, there's just all sorts of things going on there. Predominantly carnivores as well, but a range of sizes, a range of habitats all over the world pretty much. A very successful group. It's after the Carnian Pluvial episode, which was a time when it just rained for a really long time, soaking wet. This seems to be the turning point for dinosaurian dominance over Pseudosuchians. We start to see more and more dinosaurs in deposits, especially in ichnofossils. So that's trace fossils, so things like footprints. I know there's been some work done in the Alps that before the Carnian Pluvial episode, it's like all Pseudosuchians, and then after it's basically all dinosaur footprints. So a pretty big switch. And then, of course, for the rest of the Mesozoic, like I said, the dinosaurs are dominant. And arguably, they still are today. We only have, well, depending on who you ask, there's 24, 26, 28-ish species of crocodilians. It depends who you ask. But there are over 10,000 species of bird. So we're really still living in the age of dinosaurs.
How do the Triassic dinosaurs differ from later Jurassic and Cretaceous? Because not all of those lineages made it into the Jurassic.
So I've got one Triassic dinosaur on my shirt here. This is Chindisaurus, found in Petrified Forest National Park. And a lot of the dinosaurs around were looking quite like this. It's a little debated where exactly Chindisaurus sits, whether it's an actual theropod, so these meat-eating bipedal dinosaurs, including much later Velociraptor T-Rex, or whether they are like basal Saurischians, which is one of the main branches of dinosaurs, or if they're even more basal than that. I think the latest study puts Chindisaurus and another dinosaur called Tawa in a group together within theropods. But within theropods, like proper, like definitely established ones, Coelophysis is a very, very well-known dinosaur. We have literally thousands of specimens of it, mostly from a place called Ghost Ranch. There's a massive, massive Coelophysis quarry there. Like, if you go to any museum in America and you're like, I want to look at your Triassic Archosaurs, they're like, would you like to see our collection of Ghost Ranch Coelophysis skulls? I'm like, yeah, I guess I would, yeah. It's mostly smaller things like this. We do start to see some larger things as well, like Plateosaurus is another famous one that's known from quite a lot of material, and this is what we call a prosauropod. So it's not quite one of these like massive four-legged, very columnar limbs, very long necks. It's not quite at like sauropods proper yet, but it's getting there. But most dinosaurs we're seeing during this time are relatively small, although keep up to date on the news, and there's going to be some bigger ones coming out eventually. Right. I won't say any more of that.
Spoilers for the next season of Triassic. Academia.
Yeah, spoilers.
Is there a lot of radiation of these groups which aren't necessarily direct ancestors to the later dinosaurs?
Yeah, there's a fair amount. It's kind of tricky to say exactly what something's ancestor was. Like, that's really difficult to do in paleontology, again, because of the incompleteness of the fossil record and not being able to use like modern techniques like genetics and whatever, because they're just rocks. But yeah, sauropods, they are thought to have come from prosauropods, but it will be like one part of prosauropods, so they've come from one prosauropod. So they likely would have come from this group, but then there's also other prosauropods that branched off and don't have or didn't have any surviving descendants going into the Jurassic, which is pretty much the case for all groups. As they go on, you'll get these branches that go off and don't really go anywhere. They might get wiped out before they can. So yeah, it's tricky finding exactly where all these branches go, especially in the Triassic, because a lot of these dinosaurs have very basal features, so they keep a lot of ancestral traits, which makes them quite hard to distinguish where they should go, and they haven't developed later more distinguishing traits that could be used to like diagnose a group. So it is a little bit of a mess at the base of Dinosauria, but people are working on it. As I said, these are generally much smaller. Some seem to be quadrupedal, others seem to be bipedal, so walking on 4 versus 2 legs. Whereas all sauropods, like proper ones that you'll see in the Jurassic and Cretaceous, they're all quadrupedal. They all have these quite columnar limbs, which we don't really see in prosauropods yet. Long necks, which you see prosauropods sort of developing, like they're definitely getting a longer neck. If you look at like Plateosaurus or like Thecodontosaurus, they're definitely starting to get these elongated necks, but nowhere to the degree that we see in the vast majority of sauropods later on.
What I find very interesting is crocodilomorphs also having quite a lot of the same ideas as theropods.
Yeah, probably the most notable group for that would be like Poposaurids, potentially things like Pseudosuchians maybe. Poposaurids in particular, if you just gave someone like a picture of a reconstruction, they'd go, yeah, that's a theropod dinosaur, I don't know what you're talking about. They look very, very similar. So we do see these strategies being utilised by both groups. They're clearly things that work. In the case of Poposaurids, it's a similar sort of teeth, similar sort of what we call a bow plan, body plan. So they're bipedal, they've got reasonably reduced arms versus a quadrupedal animal. Pretty like straight back, long tail. It looks like a theropod. But there are differences anatomically. So like in the hips and in the ankle are big ones that we get between Pseudosuchians and dinosaurs generally. So yeah, we do see a lot of these strategies and convergent evolution between these two groups. Presumably they share a genetic ancestor, which allows them to like utilize these things in similar ways. Even if they're not homologous between the groups, they have the ability to develop these characteristics. And so they're both converging on those. So pretty neat.
Turtles aside. Are sea reptiles, such as ichthyosaurs and so on, those are archosaurs also, are they?
No. So marine reptiles would be what we call a paraphyletic group, so not a clade. But you're pulling from different clades that don't share a common ancestor. So marine reptiles is a good descriptor, but it's not a true phylogenetic group. There's a few different times that reptiles have gone back into the water. I mean, there's a few different times mammals have done it as well. If you're thinking about mosasaurs, which are most dominant in the Cretaceous, those are a different thing entirely. So they're essentially overgrown lizards. It's debated whether they're more closely related to monitor lizards or snakes. I think the prevailing view is monitor lizards. There are a couple of right weirdo marine reptiles in the Triassic. I mean, if you want a very in-depth version written by me, there is a PBS Eons episode about this really, really weird one called Atopadentatus. When it was first discovered, it looked like it had like a mouth that sort of downturns and then has like teeth. Very, very weird thing. Years later, they discovered another specimen that had been preserved in a different way, and it turns out that it actually just has like a really flat mouth with like these tiny toothpick teeth. So it might have been like filtering things. So it has that flat mouth, slightly more bulbous back of the head, quite a long neck, relatively shorter tail, kind of lumpyish body. Really strange guy. We also see things like tanistrophiids. They're fairly common around about the place. And we've been talking about sauropods and how they have long necks. They've got nothing on the tanistrophiids. It's very easy to tell when you've found a tanistrophiid vertebra in the field, because you're like, well, the ends look like a vertebra, but it's just a stick. You're like, it's a tanny. It's a tanny, of course, because not only do they add more vertebrae, they also massively, massively elongate their vertebrae to a much greater degree than we see in other long-necked animals. I think probably ever, but don't quote me on that.
I was going to say maybe like later pterosaurs, like Quetzalcoatlus.
Nah, it's not. The tanny ones are relatively longer.
Okay.
I'm just thinking of like the comparison, like pterosaur, like the Asdarchids do have these, again, like as you said, these really elongate vertebrae, but like if you had one Quetzalcoatlus vert like that, if you sized up a tanny one, it would kind of be like that off the screen. Much longer. They're very weird. They look like just stick bones, long bones, and then you look at the ends and you're like, that's a vert. And in that, they are also pretty simple. Like there's nothing, at least in the ones I've seen, there's nothing too complicated going on at the ends. The really long ones, there's not really a neural spine going on there, which is like a sticky up bit of the vertebrae. If you've got like the center, that's the neural spine. Although, of course, I'm looking at things in the field. In microcytes in particular, they could be broken. But they're pretty, apart from the length and the proportions, they're fairly undistinctive bones. We also get these in freshwater. They're not just marine. At least we're finding stuff in terrestrial deposits, so it's presumably freshwater. There is some debate. Some people thought that they might go onto land, which, if you've ever seen paintings of that, it looks ridiculous with this insane. The neck is longer than the body and tail combined. So they're just really weird. Potentially this long neck helped them to like sneak up on prey and ambush it, like long-necked plesiosaurs, because you're hiding just this like little head rather than this whole body. So that might be something. I don't know enough about tannies to say for sure, and I think there is still a bit of debate. If we move away from marine, but just go with like aquatic, semi-aquatic animals, one really important group in the late Triassic is the phytosaurs. These guys sort of define boundaries in deposits. They basically are crocodiles before crocodiles were crocodiles. And as I said, there is debate on the phylogenetics, predominantly whether they're within Archosauria or whether they're just outside it in like Archosauromorphs or Archosauriforms. So each of those groups gets like closer to Archosaurs proper. But yeah, they could be enormous, like meters and meters long. like I said, crocodiles. The easiest difference to spot between them is that crocodiles, on the end of their long snouts, have their nostrils there. Whereas phytosaurs, they still have the long snout, but the nostrils are much closer to the eyes. They're sort of more up here.
I mean, I mentioned archosaurs taking niches. They're all over the land, diversifying in various different ways, but also they were the first vertebrates to take to the skies.
Yeah. So this is before bats. Bats start appearing in the fossil record like pretty darn soon after the end of the Cretaceous, which suggests maybe there were early bats during the Cretaceous. But we get pterosaurs, which were the first vertebrates to fly. They are about in the Triassic. There's a couple of them there. And obviously they expand, do all kinds of different things later on in the Mesozoic. We have like some idea of where they came from. There's this group called the Lagurpetids, which have like quite long arms, quite long legs, that we believe pterosaurs arose from this group just by like elongating those arms more, becoming lighter and lighter, so more hollow bones, which is something that a lot of avimatatorsalians share. So that's pterosaurs, dinosaurs. And as I said, it's very tricky to like pinpoint that, yes, this group came from this animal. We don't have genetics that we can rely on to test things. We just have the bones. And so while we can say like these are two very closely related groups, this one is more basal than this one, it's hard to say that this group came from this group. For certain. They definitely might have come from something very similar, but we don't know if it's the exact ancestor.
I think most people think of them as giant reptiles of the sky, but in the Triassic, that wasn't necessarily the case.
No, much smaller than that in the Triassic, and not all that many of them that we know of, at least. We're not seeing things like huge Azhdarchids. Yeah, I mean, we could find an enormous pterosaur tomorrow, and I'd have to be like, okay, time to change that. But thus far, we don't have things like Azhdarchids, which are like the giraffe-sized pterosaurs in the Triassic. But I mean, it's not all big ones later on. I personally like the little neuronaphans that kind of look like furry frogs with wings. They're like top-tier pterosaurs
they're
for me.
Absolutely wonderful. Yeah, I want one as a pet.
Yes. Yeah, they start taking to the skies for birds, which come along in the Jurassic, at least that we know at the moment. So yeah, they're doing really cool stuff. Before that, it's just insects basically flying around.
Speaking of birds, feathers and dinosaurs. Pterosaurs for a long time were kind of predicted to be quite scaly, same as dinosaurs were. And then as the connection between dinosaurs and birds came along, it was like, okay, well, dinosaurs, if we find some in the ground with some feathers on them, then maybe we'll put feathers on them. And then some mild fluff gets seen on pterosaurs, and you go, oh, well, they're kind of proto-feathers or maybe something else. Where's that line? When do feathers show up?
That's a great question.
Yeah, if we can answer it in this podcast, that would be great. We can make history.
There's a lot of different opinions. So some people say that only theropods have true feathers, and other like fibers and integument that we find aren't true feathers. Although I reckon we can definitely bring it back to the dinosaurian ancestor having feathers, because we also see quills and feather-like structures in ornithischians, which are like the complete other branch from theropods. So in things like Psittacosaurus, it has these big quills on its tail. You get things like Tianulong, Fluffy, and then really important find is Calindrodromeus, which had, I believe it was 3 different types of feather structures on it, and it's like basically completely covered in them. So it has like these single filament ones that people are debating whether that's a feather at all. But it also had some like branching ones, which is much more indicative of a feather as we know it today. So we can bring it back to the ancestor of dinosaurs. But then, like you said, we expand out our search and we look at pterosaurs. So pterosaurs have been known to be furry for a very, very long time. It just seemed to never get picked up in paleo art. Some of the first depictions of pterosaurs we see, they basically look like horrific lizard bats with like a furry body. But there's been more recent looks at this pterosaur integument. They're generally called pycnofibers to get around the is it a feather thing. And again, we see branching structures in pterosaurs and different types of integument in pterosaurs. I believe the McNamara lab in Ireland has done some work looking at like chemical signals for this. So there's different lines of evidence for these feathers, for sure, which means that if these are both homologous structures, we can bring back the origin of feathers to the base of a metatarsalia. So we're just getting further and further and further back in time. That's where I reckon is the origin of feathers, around this like base between dinosaurs and pterosaurs. There are a couple of people who say it's ancestral to archosaurs, not many at all, but there's people out there. So yeah, I think at the moment it's most likely that we get this metatarsalia ancestor that has feathers, and then feathers are not at all ancestral to the crocodile-line Pseudosuchians. That's my best guess at the moment. I'm happy to change it if more evidence comes to light. Yeah, and I mean, like Chindisaurus here is it's depicted with some feathers. You can't quite see it from here, but it does have them in the shirt. There's a big conversation around this still, where this integument first originated. With the evidence we have now, I think, yeah, it's likely that things in the Triassic had, at the very least, like simple filaments.
I think I'm still in that mindset of let's add massive feathers to everything, but we're in the scientific realm now, and the artistic realm, we can have our fun, but yeah, we can't be certain.
No, we can't be sure, unless we were to suddenly find complete skin impressions of like every metatarsalia, then, which I think is quite unlikely. It is difficult to be 100% certain in science. I was going to say in paleontology, but even in science, we're always trying to disprove our hypotheses. That's just how science works.
It's a nice idea. They were fluffy, but that's just me.
Yeah.
What are you hoping to read from looking at teeth? Like, are there any particular behaviours or diets which that's opening up?
So yeah, like the final idea was, as I was saying, Aetosaur teeth are virtually non-existent, isolated in the fossil record. I mean, there's hardly any of them in skulls, which was like the main problem. So hopefully, like with this sort of data set and new methodology, the ideal outcome eventually, sort of at the end, honestly, probably after my PhD, continued research, will be to use this as an aid in identifying these teeth. So you could put in like a bunch of teeth from a microsite and see where they plot on these different graphs. We'll get some nice separation between groups, and we'd be like, okay, this one's fallen like well within the Aetosaur cloud that we get. In fact, there was Staglolepus, or at the very least just an Aetosaur, which is closer than we've managed to get so far. A similar thing with looking at carnivorous ones that sort of retain this plesiomorphic, this ancestral tooth shape that I mentioned earlier, the laterally compressed, recurved, serrated tooth shape. Looking at those ones that retain that or potentially even revert to it. Is this a shape that's just been kept? Is it a shape that groups have reverted to? Is it a shape that things have like modified a bit in one group but not in another? Basically just like looking at how this ancestral tooth shape has evolved and is different in different groups in the Triassic.
You've mentioned teeth being difficult to find in certain groups. Is there anything which you're kind of cursing that we don't know about, isn't preserved? Is there any issues with Triassic in particular?
I mean, we've mentioned the integument. That would be nice to have more of that from like more basal metatarsalia. One thing that we really want is some eggs. We'd love some eggs from the Triassic. It's really weird. They should be there. Like everything pretty much should be laying eggs at the time. But we don't have them. It's really weird. Find a nest of Triassic eggs and you might just get a nature paper out of that just by merit of finding this thing that's never been found. The further back in time you go, fewer deposits are likely to still be around, because if you just think about like mountain building, for example, so you get the mountain, all these rocks are pushed up, and then that mountain weathers down. So we lose all of the rocks that were above, like where this mountain weathered down to. So we don't have everything that was laid down preserved. Some places where we do get preservation, they're just like inaccessible for one reason or another. There's a very famous Lagerstätte in the UK called the Strawberry Bank Lagerstätte that was just built over. You can barely access it anymore, if at all, because it's just had a town built on top of it. So things like that like definitely complicate searches. But we have a pretty idea of where we know things are, or by looking at geological maps, we can figure out where to go to look for things. So we have that to help us. But yeah, as you said, it's going back in time. I mean, the Triassic is still a relatively recent part of Earth's history. It's only 200 million years ago, as opposed to there are people in the sort of wider paleo group here who are working on like Ediacaran things, which are about like 640 million years old. So like the first sort of like animals. And they have a lot of problems finding good deposits for that. But they have them. And then, of course, like you go even further back than that, and the planet is like, was it 4.8 billion years old? So most of like paleontology is happening in this really, really short space of time compared to how long the Earth has been around.
If you could go back to the Triassic, what do you wish you could see? And any questions you hope we would have answered?
Yeah, I really love Aetosaurs. I would like to see how they live, whether they are like using these like little snoots to root around in the dirt to find like tubers and stuff, whether they are scratch diggers. There's a few papers out about that, like the mobility of the limbs and how suited they are for digging. So I'd like to see that, see how herbivorous they are, all sorts of things. And then of course where you've got Aetosaurs, you've got just like a bunch of other Triassic stuff. So it's really cool to see how that whole ecosystem would sort of work together. Who's eating who, what different like reproductive strategies. There's likely to be like nest building. That's a shared trait between crocodiles and birds. That's likely to be something that happened. Whether we get parental care, because we do have a couple of deposits of Aetosaurs in big groups, and they're mostly like juveniles. So do they have like a creche behavior where they just like all hang out together? So many questions.
Yeah, for me is who's got feathers, who's got fluff, but that's...
Yes, that also. You're going to take their temperature as well.
Yeah. Are you fluffy? How warm are you? Tell us about yourself. Where can we find you?
The best place to find me is on my Instagram, which is Deinonychus Floof. Basically, the dinosaur Deinonychus and then Floof at the end, because it was fluffy. And then I also have a website. It has like my whole CV and everything, if anyone wants to hire me. And then check out Paleocast as well, because I'm doing some stuff with them.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Emily. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for having me.